The British thought they were being rescued. Bombs rained over London, ships sank in the Atlantic, and their economy teetered on collapse. Then came America, not with troops, but with promises. Through the Lend-Lease Act, Washington shipped tanks, planes, and food across the ocean. But what looked like salvation came with a silent invoice. Decades later, historians wouldn't call it aid. They'd call it leverage. Behind every shipment was a clause, a condition, a chain. While Churchill spoke of alliance, Roosevelt's treasury counted debts. This wasn't just war support. It was economic positioning. As factories roared in Detroit, London sank deeper into obligation. The war ended, but the payments didn't. Even into the 21st century, echoes of that help haunted Britain's budgets. What began as lifeline turned into leash. And America learned a lesson it would never forget. Money, used right, was more powerful than missiles. In March 1941, months before America officially entered World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act into law. Publicly, it was framed as a generous gesture, an effort to support the embattled Allies without dragging the U.S. into war. But behind the patriotic speeches was a colder calculation. The United Kingdom at the time was running out of money, food, and firepower. Churchill pleaded for help, and Roosevelt responded with supplies, on credit. Billions of dollars worth of tanks, aircraft, ships, and raw materials flowed across the Atlantic, often praised as a symbol of democratic solidarity. But the fine print told a different story. In exchange for aid, the U.S. demanded British overseas bases, favorable trade agreements, and long-term debt commitments. Washington wasn't just helping a friend. It was strategically positioning itself to inherit the British Empire's global influence. While bombs fell over London, British officials were forced to sign away economic sovereignty in quiet rooms. The UK had to dismantle imperial trade preferences and open up its markets to American goods, laying the groundwork for post-war U.S. dominance. At war's end, Lend-Lease was abruptly terminated, leaving Britain scrambling to find funds just to pay for what had already arrived. The total debt? Over $31 billion, a staggering amount for a country already on its knees. Britain's last repayment wasn't made until 2006. What was once framed as a brotherly lifeline turned out to be a long-term leash with interest. The Lend-Lease program was more than just wartime logistics. It was an economic masterstroke. While Europe bled, America banked. And by the time the guns fell silent, Washington hadn't just helped win the war. It had bought a seat at the head of the New World Order, paid for in British desperation and decades of debt. In the early days of World War II, Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught. Its cities were burning, its fleets stretched thin, and its treasury bleeding dry. By the winter of 1940, the British government had already spent the majority of its gold reserves and U.S. dollar assets purchasing arms and materials from American suppliers. Churchill knew survival depended on one thing: American support. But Roosevelt had no intention of offering a blank check. What emerged was the Lend-Lease Act, publicly hailed as a lifeline, privately designed as leverage. It allowed the United States to send military aid to any country, vital to the defense of the United States, a vague and conveniently broad phrase. The program became a pipeline of war goods, bullets, tanks, food, oil, flowing from American factories to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allied nations. But what made Lend-Lease revolutionary wasn't the volume, it was the financial structure. Instead of demanding immediate payment, the U.S. leased materials with the vague expectation of repayment later, under terms dictated by Washington. That ambiguity wasn't generosity, it was power. Britain, desperate to survive, accepted whatever terms were set, even if it meant surrendering economic autonomy. Under the surface, the act marked a strategic shift. America wasn't simply aiding an ally, it was re-engineering the global balance of power. As British ships docked in Halifax to pick up munitions, American negotiators quietly inserted clauses demanding naval bases across the Caribbean, rights to airfields, and trade concessions that undercut Britain's colonial markets. The British Empire was being mortgaged piece by piece, not to Germany, but to its so-called partner. The United Kingdom, once the world's dominant creditor nation, was transformed into the world's largest debtor overnight. Lend-Lease made this transition swift and irreversible. In Washington, Treasury officials debated how far they could push their demands without risking British collapse. The goal wasn't to destroy Britain, but to ensure it would never again dominate global trade as it had before the war. By 1942, Britain was so entangled in the Lend-Lease system that Churchill privately admitted his country was financially at the mercy of the United States. Publicly, he maintained the illusion of equal partnership. But behind closed doors, British officials watched in growing discomfort as their leverage evaporated. In a single generation, London went from lender to beggar. And America, the one-time colony, now held the mortgage to the empire. While the war raged on in Europe and the Pacific, American policymakers were already looking to the future, designing a world order where the dollar replaced the pound, where New York replaced London, and where economic influence supplanted colonial control. The most ruthless aspect of Lend-Lease wasn't the material, it was the psychological trap. America cast itself as a benevolent savior, a reluctant power forced into leadership. But the truth was colder. Every shipment to Britain came with strings. Every favor had a future cost. British officials were pressured to restructure their economy, dismantle imperial protections, and adopt American trade norms. The free world was being reconstructed on American terms. After the war, when Lend-Lease was abruptly terminated in September 1945, Britain was left reeling. Much of the aid received had not been gifts. It had been bills. The U.S. demanded repayment not just in money but in influence. The 1946 Anglo-American Loan Agreement forced Britain to accept harsh terms: full dollar convertibility, reduction of imperial trade preferences, and supervision over economic recovery. The strings of Lend-Lease turned into chains. One of the most telling outcomes of this economic entrapment was the 1947 sterling crisis. Faced with the obligation to make the pound convertible into U.S. dollars, British reserves drained rapidly. Within weeks, the British economy teetered on the edge again, and convertibility had to be suspended. The U.S. had imposed its model, but the U.K. was too weak to sustain it. The irony: Britain had helped defeat fascism, only to be forced into a form of soft dependency, dictated not by tanks, but by treaties and transfers. For decades, the debt lingered. Annual payments chipped away at British budgets until the last installment was made on December 29, 2006. That final check, just over $83 million, wasn't just the end of a financial agreement. It was a silent reminder of how victory had been bought with borrowed money, and how that money came at a generational cost. While American textbooks praised Lend-Lease as a symbol of heroism, British documents told a quieter truth. The war had been won, that sovereignty had been sold. And America had discovered a formula far more potent than invasion: economic entrapment. What began with Lend-Lease evolved into a doctrine. In the decades that followed, similar models would appear, first in the Marshall Plan, then through institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Aid was never just aid. It was policy by other means. Conditions were baked into every offer. Structural reforms, austerity, deregulation, these became the new weapons of influence. By the late 20th century, dozens of developing nations would find themselves repeating Britain's story, trapped not by empires, but by loans. Yet Lend-Lease remains the original case study, a moment when money was weaponized so effectively that it redrew the geopolitical map without firing a shot. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a transfer of power, masked as partnership. And it worked. The United States emerged from World War II not just as a military victor, but as the central banker of the modern world. Its factories untouched, its dollar dominant, and its former allies now debtors. All because, in 1941, America discovered that debt, when structured strategically, could achieve what armies could not. The Lend-Lease Act was only the beginning. What started as a wartime necessity quickly evolved into a long-term strategy, a blueprint for American empire without colonies. In the ashes of World War II, as Europe lay in ruins and old powers collapsed under their own weight, the United States saw an opportunity. Not just to lead, but to shape. and money would be the scalpel. The British experience had shown that financial assistance, when structured correctly, could extract more influence than military occupation. The next iteration of this approach was the Marshall Plan. Again, it was sold as salvation, $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe, prevent communism, and restore prosperity. But baked into the aid were conditions. Recipients had to open their markets, align politically with U.S. interests, and allow oversight over spending. In exchange for food, machinery, and investment, nations gave up parts of their economic autonomy. French industry was modernized, but it also became dependent on American inputs. West Germany rebuilt quickly, but its banking system followed the American model. Every dollar came with a footprint. This economic diplomacy became the architecture of the New World Order. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and IMF, and the World Bank were all formed with American fingerprints and American funding. On paper, these institutions promoted stability and growth. In practice, they replicated the Lend-Lease pattern: offer money during crisis, attach conditions, reshape economies. By the 1970s, this formula had gone global. Dozens of newly independent nations, freed from colonial rule but mired in poverty, turned to these institutions for help. What they got instead were structural adjustment programs, demands to cut public spending, privatize industries, liberalize trade, and devalue currencies. Countries like Argentina, Ghana, and Indonesia found themselves locked into cycles of debt and austerity. Economic sovereignty was traded for liquidity. And behind the boardrooms of Washington, American influence spread, quietly, efficiently, and without troops. This model worked because it was disguised as help. The IMF never marched into a country with tanks. It arrived with accountants, lawyers, and PowerPoint slides. But the effects were just as devastating. Social safety nets were gutted. Local industries collapsed under pressure from cheaper imports. Inflation soared as currencies were floated and devalued, and every failed reform justified the need for another loan. In many cases, these rescue packages prolonged crises instead of solving them. But for Washington, the real goal was never purely humanitarian. It was strategic control. Debt created dependency, and dependency meant compliance. A country desperate for foreign exchange reserves was unlikely to vote against U.S. interests at the United Nations. It was unlikely to nationalize American companies. It was unlikely to side with the wrong superpower. Debt was the leash. Policy alignment was the price. The echoes of Lend-Lease can be heard in every corner of the modern financial order. In Ukraine's IMF agreements, in Sri Lanka's bailout conditions, in Pakistan's energy reforms. The script remains the same: aid in crisis, terms in fine print, influence secured. But what makes this system so resilient is its invisibility. Most citizens don't see the negotiations. They don't vote on the loan agreements. They only feel the aftermath: fuel price hikes, public sector layoffs, and inflation that eats through savings. And when they protest, they're told it's necessary sacrifice. The invisible war of debt leaves no ruins, but it does leave scars. Back in 1941, Britain thought it was fighting for freedom. What it didn't realize was that the war's true cost wouldn't be measured in blood, but in balance sheets. The United States learned that lesson well. It saw that the world didn't need to be conquered, it could be financed. And so began the age of economic empire, forged not by force, but by funding. The weapons changed, but the outcome remained: power, restructured in America's image. In the modern era, the tactics of Lend-Lease have been reborn under a different name: IMF rescue packages. The settings have changed. The flags are different, but the pattern remains. A country plunges into crisis: currency collapse, food shortages, debt default. The headlines scream panic. And then the IMF steps in. It offers billions in emergency loans, framed as global solidarity. But buried beneath the press releases and handshakes are documents laced with conditionalities. The money never comes free. In exchange, the country must restructure its economy, cut subsidies, sell off state assets, float the currency, raise interest rates, and open its markets to foreign capital. What appears to be rescue is in fact redesign. What looks like help is actually leverage. Take Sri Lanka. After its 2022 economic collapse, the IMF extended a $3 billion loan, but the deal included slashing fuel subsidies, raising taxes, and implementing strict austerity measures. The goal, they said, was to restore fiscal discipline. But the result was pain. Prices skyrocketed. Wages stagnated. Protests erupted. The same cycle has repeated in Argentina, where IMF loans have come and gone for decades, leaving behind inflation, capital flight, and deepening inequality. Each new loan promises stability. Each repayment drains the system further. In Pakistan, conditions attached to IMF bailouts forced sharp hikes in energy prices and interest rates, triggering unrest across major cities. In Ghana, entire public programs were gutted to satisfy foreign lenders. The justification is always the same: fiscal responsibility, market confidence, macroeconomic stability. But none of these slogans feed people. None of them reduce hunger or ease rent. What they do is ensure repayment, on time, in dollars. IMF packages, like Lend-Lease before them, function less as humanitarian relief and more as instruments of compliance. They're written in the language of finance but executed in the logic of control. Nations in crisis don't negotiate. They concede. Their urgency becomes the creditor's advantage. And behind the IMF's neutral logo is a voting system heavily weighted in Washington's favor. The United States remains the largest shareholder. No major decision can be made without its approval. So when the IMF acts, it often echoes American interests. Geopolitical allies are rewarded with softer terms. Dissenters face tougher restrictions. What makes this modern trap even more effective is its invisibility. Unlike tanks or treaties, debt agreements are rarely debated on television. They are negotiated in closed rooms between ministers and technocrats. The public only feels the aftershock. Gas prices up, pensions cut, local industries wiped out by foreign competition. The democratic process is bypassed. The pain is privatized. Meanwhile, U.S. influence spreads without a single soldier deployed. This is not accidental. It is systemic. The architecture built after World War II ensures that financial dependency translates into political compliance. And in this new world, obedience is extracted not with bullets, but with balance sheets. The leash is still there. It's just hidden beneath contracts and capital flows. Lend-Lease taught America a lesson. If you want control, don't invade. The world today is living proof. The global consequences of this debt-based dominance don't stay overseas. They come home, quietly, steadily, and with a price tag that lands on the American taxpayer. Every time the U.S. underwrites a rescue package through the IMF or sends billions in foreign aid, it isn't just a diplomatic gesture. It's a financial commitment backed by printing presses, treasury debt, and political capital. While the media frames it as leadership, the economic burden often flows back into the domestic economy through inflationary pressure, rising deficits, and redirected priorities. In theory, foreign influence brings strategic benefits, but in practice, the costs mount, especially in an economy already strained by its own internal contradiction. Washington's imperial reach comes with domestic recoil. The mechanics are simple. When trillions are sent abroad, whether in the form of loans, military aid, or IMF contributions, the U.S. either borrows more or prints more. Both pathways inject liquidity, but also increase risk. Foreign lending rarely generates direct returns for average Americans. Instead, it often forces the government to make trade-offs, cutting social programs, raising interest rates to tame inflation, or inflating away the debt. Each move hits households first, through higher food prices, mortgage costs, or lost public services. The illusion is that empire is cheap. The truth is that it's subsidized by those who will never benefit from it. Take recent years. While billions were spent stabilizing Ukraine's economy or funding IMF bailouts across Africa and Asia, many U.S. cities faced crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable housing, and stagnant wages. The average citizen never gets a say in whether Sri Lanka deserves another bailout. But they feel it when their grocery bill jumps or their rent rises. That's the hidden cost of empire, the slow erosion of domestic stability in the name of global power. America learned how to control the world with money. But in doing so, it may have mortgaged its own future. Lend-Lease was never just about war. It was about redefining power, quietly, strategically, and with permanent consequences. What began as a desperate lifeline for Britain became the prototype for an entire world system, one where money replaced armies and debt replaced conquest. Today, that system is still alive, wearing different names: foreign aid, rescue packages, development loans. But the logic remains intact. All for help during crisis, attach invisible strings, extract long-term control. It's efficient, deniable, and devastating. No need for boots on the ground when balance sheets do the job. The irony is brutal. Nations seek help to survive, only to be locked into systems that prevent true independence. They trade one kind of collapse for another: military defeat for economic suffocation. And while global leaders meet in clean conference rooms, the average citizen pays in silence. Through inflation, austerity, lost jobs, and foreign ownership. The promise of recovery becomes a loop of dependence. But this isn't just their problem. It's ours. The same financial machinery that tightens its grip abroad eventually turns inward. The deficits balloon. The money loses value. The cost of control bleeds into everyday American life. Food gets pricier. Rent climbs. Confidence erodes. The empire, built on credit and control, becomes a burden no longer hidden. So when we speak of Lend-Lease, we're not talking about the past. We're talking about a system that never ended, just evolved. It still rewards the few and extracts from the many. It still speaks in the language of aid but acts in the logic of empire. And until that illusion is broken, debt will remain the sharpest weapon in America's arsenal, one that turns even allies into assets and citizens into collateral.